Welcome back to APUS History, Lesson 4. Today we're going to talk about colonial America within the British Empire, a continuation of the establishment of a series of the colonial colonies. And to start with this process, first thing I want to do with you all is a quick review, just a quick review over the types of colonies that the British had in the New World. The first type of colony they had was a joint stock company, which is essentially, as you should know from some of your reading and learning on your own in history class, pretty much a corporation. People were funded for this colony by paying shares of stock into it. The colony had to turn a profit, and its profit would then turn into dividends for the shareholders, which is their incentive to invest in the first place. A second type of colony that they had in the New World that the British established were royal colonies. These were like the colonies of France and Spain. They were colonies that were property of the state, crown or royal colonies. They were always owned by the government, always intended to be owned by the government. They were full territories of the nation state, with the rules and laws being applied by the nation state authorities, the army, the government, etc. The final type of colony, which plays an awful lot in today's lecture, would be the proprietary colony. A proprietary colony is a colony where a large tract of land is granted by the king as a personal gift to an individual of note for any number of reasons, and that individual then is sole owner of that land and can create the rules and governance for that land sort of as that individual saw fit. So we're going to talk today about the Restoration Colonies. So we've got a few of them here and a few of the colonies we talked about in Lesson 3. Today's colonies we're going to talk about are the Restoration Colonies, which are mostly the middle colonies, or the so-called middle colonies. Now, restoration from what? This refers to a term from world history. After the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, rules England for the better part of about a decade or a dozen years. It's the end of the Anglican or the Catholic Anglican Puritan struggle in many ways. After Cromwell's death, the monarchy is restored, hence the term restoration, restored to the throne in England under Charles II in 1660. And among the things that Charles II did is he established, first of all, among his colonies, North and South Carolina. These were proprietary colonies who were granted to influential allies who had, as a reward for their services, who had been loyal to him during this process of getting the crown restored. These colonies were tied closely into the West Indies in terms of where they came from, the West Indies being the Bahamas area, the Cuban area, Santo Domingo, even Spanish holdings down here, which were economically driven by the sugar and spice trades and slavery. And so much of the DNA of how to establish these colonies in North and South Carolina was going to come out of the way that colonies were established by the British in Nassau, in the Bahamas, in the West Indies, and they were going to try to pull that model with its labor model up to North and South Carolina during this time. So they were tied there. South Carolina is going to become a colony that will grow rice, and it's going to use this entire plantation slavery model that we saw in the West Indies. They're going to try to employ it there, the attraction being clearly a lot more land than you had on the islands of the West Indies. North Carolina was going to have not as much in the way of rice and less large land holdings. It was going to be more tobacco, and it can sort of make sense to you why. If everything happens for a reason, even if this colony of North Carolina is established by the same proprietors that founded South Carolina, notice what it's close to. It's rubbing right up against Virginia. The Virginia Tidewater tobacco model is going to kind of bleed over as well. Some of the indentured servants were squatters that already moved into that territory as they were freemen who'd left on their own, and poor landless people were coming in this area to acquire and establish land for themselves. So you will have a plantation model in North Carolina, but not to the extent of the model that you have in South Carolina. You'll have more smaller land holdings and more growing of tobacco, which is what you're seeing climate-wise and also culturally from their neighbors to the north. Moving northward up our map then, we can talk about New York. New York starts out life as New Amsterdam. It's a Dutch colony. It was the Dutch holdings that they had claimed for the region from earlier lessons and lessons you'd had in your own history course. And it has its origins as part of the Dutch West Indies Company. The Duke of York grants this land to his brother. James II grants this land to his brother, the Duke of York, and says, I'm granting this to you as a proprietorship. Essentially, it's up to you to go and take it. His brother, as commander of the Royal Navy, then proceeds to arrive with a large military force and in a virtually bloodless coup, if you will, takes over this area and renames it New York. Now, even though it is now taken over by the British the Duke of York did allow the original Dutch settlers to kind of live as they had previously lived. He was interested in the colony of pursuing it as a profit-making item for himself. So New York is going to maintain and continue from this point forward its large trade, mercantile commerce, and business sort of proclivities that it had during this time, leaning in that general direction, and that's going to be a central element of the establishment and continued growth of this colony. On to Pennsylvania and the great Holy Experiment. Delaware, just for purposes of our knowing it now, Delaware was the bottom 3 counties of Pennsylvania that William Penn will eventually separate and allow to kind of be their own colony, even though they'll be governed under the same charter as Pennsylvania, so they're sort of de facto the same for the initial birth period. But what you need to know about Pennsylvania, as our colony being established here, was granted to William Penn's father. William Penn himself is going to become a Quaker, remember the Society of Friends, which is going to be a religion that is rather persecuted during this time. Penn is going to want to set up what he calls the Holy Experiment, a colony where he was going to allow for almost what Rhode Island had, but on a larger scale, freedom of religion, no church or no state religion that was mandated within the Commonwealth, and also no restrictions on immigration. He was going to try to set up a model that was going to make him money, make him rich, but also try out some of his theories that he had learned about as a member of the Society of Friends, of a society of people being equal to one another and working and living together as equals. Pennsylvania is also, other than Rhode Island, the only colony that did make attempts, all throughout the time of Penn's existence at least, to fairly compensate the Native Americans for their lands. It's the only colony that tried to actually give due compensation. Once this colony gets filled up with more and more immigrants coming over, almost like what happened in Maryland that you guys have learned about earlier, the new immigrants aren't necessarily going to follow his Quaker teachings, and then Pennsylvania will be like the rest, where it's simply this relentless westward land push. But it's going to be a populous, it's going to be the, other than Virginia, the most populated colony. It's going to be very prosperous and very diverse from the beginning. It's going to be a colony, as these middle colonies, New York and Pennsylvania, were economically quite versatile, and economically in many ways the breadbasket of the colonies. The final colony to look at, you can see where it is on the map, is going to be Georgia. Okay, the last of the colonies to be established in 1733. In earlier lessons, we discussed the notion of the Spanish setting up their Texas colonies and Florida colonies sort of as shoulders to try to limit the encroachment of New France and expansion of New France. Well, Georgia is a dual-purpose colony from the British point of view. Georgia is set up to act as a wall, a buffer between Spanish Florida and further Spanish possible encroachment rolling up northward into the colonies. So it's set up as sort of a demilitarized zone, if you will, or a militarized zone for the purpose of making sure the Spanish couldn't go any further up. But second, though, based on the thinkings of its founder, James Oglethorpe, Georgia is set up as a debtor colony or a penal colony. In other words, it was a colony for which people who were imprisoned, largely because of their debts, who could never get out because once you're in prison you can't generate the revenue necessary to get out of debt, could be emptied from England's jails, sent to the New World where they could actually do things of economic worth and value both for themselves and also for the crown. So it was set up along the model of sort of a social experiment. Could debtors and prisoners be turned loose in the New World? That's not fair to say, not turned loose, but could they be replanted in the New World under certain colonial restrictions and rules of English governance and turn out to be productive citizens for the colony and for the empire and for their own good? Now, when it comes to the empire and the colonies and their own good, the own good of the empire, as it saw it, relates to another AP history term, very important term that you're going to need to be familiar with, the M word, mercantilism. So as we're discussing mercantilism as imperial policy, it's important for us to define or figure out what this policy is. Mercantilism is an economic worldview. It's an economic philosophy that says that the planet only has a limited amount of wealth and resources on it. It's only got, for instance, so much diamonds, so much gold, so much silver, so much oil, so much lumber, so much whatever. It's only got this finite limited amount. So that nations, in order to maximize their wealth, ought to try to extend themselves and have colonies elsewhere to gather and acquire this wealth and direct it home. Under mercantilist philosophy, the only reason that any colony would exist under this philosophy, whether it's a British colony, French colony, Dutch colony, Spanish, whoever, the only reason a colony exists is to enrich the home country or enrich the mother country. So they exist as points of discovery and transit of items of value, which then are shipped or transshipped back to the home nation to maximize that wealth. As part of this policy, as part of what's going to happen with it, England is going to begin adopting this policy, as all the great powers of the time period did. It's going to establish a series of laws that initially did not exist. When the colonies were first set up in your history class and in our earlier lessons, the colonies were largely kind of set up to do as they saw fit. Sure, they had to make a profit for their shareholders. Sure, they had to kind of guarantee a new labor supply coming in, but there weren't a lot of economic restrictions on how they did business. That will not stay that way, though. As the colonies increase in value, and England sees the fact that there's value there to be had, resources that could be brought home, wealth to be generated, England increasingly begins to see these colonies acting as sort of an ATM machine that they need to regulate and supervise and have more direct oversight over. Hence the beginning of what are known as the Trade and Navigation Acts. The Trade and Navigation Acts were a series of policies passed in the 20 years after the 1650s that tried to sort of direct or channel the nature of colonial business enterprise. For instance, one of the navigation acts, like sailing, navigation, was an act that said that all goods that left the colonies could only be shipped out of the colonies on English vessels or on vessels with English captains or English crews, or colonial crews with English captains. Well, if you can control the means of conveyance of an item, you can control the final destination of the item. This is exactly what England's attempting to do. Another item of the Navigation Act said that, a second one later on passed, said that any good that left the colonies, no matter where it went, had to pass through a British port in England first. Same kind of thing. Or, for instance, an act that said that there are certain things, certain products the colonies produced that could only go to England. The one that comes to mind most rapidly, and obviously, is tobacco. And there were also certain goods that the colonies could only buy from England, thereby providing a guaranteed market for English goods. Now, the good news for the colonials on this is that New England shipbuilding skyrocketed, because New England's going to become now the home of because it had better harbors than the South, and you've got all the forests up there anyways, it's going to become the home of England's western branch of shipbuilding and ship construction and navigation and commerce and trade. It's going to be a large depot area, if you will, a giant kind of UPS warehouse, I guess you could say. On the other hand, the other things that are good is English forces are going to protect the colonies. They're going to bring troops over, boots on the ground. It's not going to be about the New England Confederation anymore, or King Philip's War. You have a greater English presence here to hold that off, because England now has a vested interest. England has a vested interest in seeing those Native Americans pushed far enough away from the sphere of where their colonies are so they can't meddle and destroy this trade, and so that the colonial trade can get off the ground, even if it's doing it in accordance with the Navigation Acts. And also attacks from the French and Spanish. Georgia, the buffer state, military presence there, keep out French and Spanish encroachment, etc. The downside for the colonies is, some of this is kind of obvious. If mercantilism says a colony only exists in order to benefit the home country, well, that's great if you live in the home country. If you live in the colony, your whole existence is now subservient to this other place that's way, way far away. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to start to figure out that over time the colonials might be resentful of some of this system, because they're going to see themselves as being used by this system, because the benefits are subsidiary to some of the drawbacks. The drawbacks being that since their goods were, like tobacco, had to go to England, England also set the price that those goods were going to be traded at, which was lower than the fair market value the colonists could get. In other words, if the colonists had traded beyond England, they could have gotten more money for their products. That's going to generate a lot of resentment. Also, you had the issue of goods the colonials were forbidden to make. That was designed to make it so they had to buy those goods from England. That's great for English factories, not so good for the colonial consumers, who now have to pay English prices because they got nowhere else to go. It's not like they can go to ditch brand X to go buy this at the store for brand Y. There's only brand X, and the guy who makes brand X can charge whatever price he can charge. And if you want that piece of furniture, if you want that plow, if you want that gun, if you want that article of clothing, you're going to pay that price to go do without, because you've got no other alternative to anywhere else to get it in the colonies. That's going to cause frustration. And so you've got these low prices, they got to buy these manufactured goods, and as a result, the other side of this is the colonies could not manufacture their goods. Their economy is artificially stunted. The natural kind of growth you might have seen, like in the woolens industry or the iron industry here in America, never took place because the British legally forbid it from happening. So the colonial growth was sort of stunted and limited in an economic sense, which is going to put limitations on their ability to develop and acquire and generate wealth for themselves over time, which was going to be frustrating for them.